we're back for part 2 of chapter 4 in global economies. Basically what this question is why do companies expand internationally and how do they do it? Well, companies expand internationally for 5 reasons. One, the supplies, availability of supplies. They want to open up new markets. Outside of the U.S., they can find lower labor costs. It's cheaper in many cases. Access to financial capital. Sometimes international markets will loan to you if you go to an international market other than the U.S. And another very big reason is to avoid tariffs and import quotas. If you're within that country, then you're not importing, or you're also not subject to tariff regulations or fees. There are several examples of companies in the U.S. that manufacture outside. Apple is a very biggie. Ethan Allen Furniture, Procter & Gamble, consumer products. There's also the car industry, GM and Ford. Ford has many companies or many factories in Mexico. So about all of our large corporations in the U.S. have went outside of the country, which brings up expanding internationally. There are 5 ways you can outsource, global outsourcing, and you need to understand the distinction here. Companies can outsource, which is using suppliers from outside the company to provide goods and services, and that's usually within the country. Global outsourcing or offshoring is defined as using suppliers outside of the United States. And this is what many companies have done. If you look at Subaru, it's sort of an inverse in relation to that. Subaru is from Japan. They came to the United States to build cars here, simply to get around some of the tariffs and the quotas. But they actually outsource a lot of their piecework and their subassemblies to other satellite factories around in Lafayette. So it's sort of a complex way of looking at outsourcing. They can expand by importing, exporting, and counter-trading. I think everybody knows what importing and exporting is. The counter-trading you may not be too aware of, and that's where they barter goods for goods. Maybe it's more efficient, maybe they don't have the capital to buy the goods, or maybe doing goods to goods gets around the money exchange rate. So that's another way. There's licensing and franchising. Both are very similar. Franchising is a little more complex form of licensing, as I think there's more buy-in with franchising from an international company in another country. And then there are joint ventures, and that is where 2 companies will come together. I think Subaru used to work with, oh my goodness, I'm going to forget it. Subaru used to work with a company, an auto company in the U.S., and I've forgotten who that is, but it was a joint venture. They came together and created the plant in Lafayette. And finally, there is wholly owned subsidies, such as they will come in. The plant in the trailer plant in Monon is totally owned by the Japanese company, as is the the aluminum plant in Lafayette. They totally come in. They own the entire thing and totally invest all of their money into it, which is a little riskier than a joint venture. And so you can see there are 5 ways. There's outsourcing, there's importing and exporting, and counter trading, licensing and franchising. Each one of these gets a little more risky. If you invest in a company that's unstable, or invest your plant in a company that's unstable, the possibility of losing that investment is very high. We will talk about global outsourcing and which jobs are likely to fall victim to offshoring. Kind of think about that. I think Crawfordsville has experienced some of this. I know Monticello has. So what jobs do you think are safe? And we have a question, true or false? Outsourcing is using suppliers outside the company to find services, and global outsourcing is using suppliers outside of the country to find services. That needs an S. Let's do that. Next thing we look at is what is governing this? What is the barriers? What are the barriers to free trade? And what are the major organizations and trading blocs that promote free trade? This has not been an easy battle. Many people in the United States are against free trade. And there's a raging controversy about whether it's good or bad for the U.S. So there are several organizations that try to promote free trade. We have the Regional Economic, and this is the Regional Economic cooperation that you find. There's free trade, and it's a movement of goods and services among nations without political or economic obstruction. That's almost very difficult to get in the purest sense, but we are getting better at it. Barriers to international trade are many countries often use trade protection, and those come in three varieties. One is a tariff, which is a fee that is levied, or an import quota, which means you can only bring in so much, or you can have an embargo, a complete embargo that bans import or export of certain items. In particular, one's been in the news is the Cuban cigars, or the Cuba in particular. We have embargoed Cuba for many years, and now that embargo is being lifted. Tariffs, that was a really big thing when the Japanese were importing cars, as was the import quota. So those are three ways that companies try to protect their own economies. There's some organizations that tries to and does promote international trade. There's the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Each of these organizations in their own right is somewhat controversial. We won't go into that now, but if this is controversial, just free trade in general is controversial, then the organizations promoting it definitely are going to have some controversy surrounding them. And then we have major trading blocs, and those are agreements of companies or countries that have come together and said, yes, we're going to have open trade. NAFTA is one, a North American Free Trade Agreement. The European Union is another, where 27 countries in Europe have come together. There's also APEC, which is the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, which is the Pacific Rim countries. And there's Mercosur, and that's a major trading bloc in Latin America. And then there is CAFTA, which is Central America. So there are several, and the United States participates in all of these. And then there's always the most favored nation status that is given to countries that are friendly and meet certain qualifications for importing and exporting. And we have a question here. True or false? NAFTA and the EU are examples of a trade bloc. And finally, we look at cultural differences, which are really big. And it's really important to understand these differences because many times we are walking into another person's space and inadvertently violating what their cultural values are. And if you move to one of these countries, or even if you work within a company that is from an international country within the U.S., sometimes we can experience what they call culture shock. So it's forewarned is much better than looking at it after the fact. Cultural dimensions, which is an interesting project here, the Globe Project, has found there are three things to be very aware of with cultural differences. First of all, the misunderstandings, arise from people not understanding the expectations of the other side. And one of the two areas that are very interesting are what they call a low context culture, which shares meanings with written words and spoken words. And the U.S. and Great Britain and Germany are examples of this. But then there's the high context culture, which looks at situational and nonverbal clues, and those would include China, Korea, Japan, Mexico, Latin America. So there's a whole different way of communicating between those two cultures. And the Global Project keeps looking at these and has found 9 cultural dimensions that are involved in the leadership processes and the difference. There's the power distance, depending on how equal the society is. Who's going to share the power? There's the uncertainty avoidance, the extent to which society relies on social norms to alleviate unpredictable future events. There's institutional collectivism. Wow, that's an interesting word. That's how people are encouraged or rewarded for the loyalty that they give the institution. The same thing could be said about the in-group collectivism, which is how much people take pride in being members of their family or their circle. Japan is very in-group oriented, as are many of the Latin American countries. There's gender to consider. Many countries do not consider equal rights between genders. Saudi Arabia or the Arabs, Arabian countries come to mind with this. Assertiveness, how much competition or how much confrontation can be expected or actually encouraged when ideas are brought forth. Whether a country is future-oriented or not. Performance-oriented to the extent they encourage and reward people for improvement and excellence. And then humane orientation, where we're looking at caring, kind, and generous and fair. Some countries, when they get into business, that is not part of it, and it's important that we understand which countries those are. American or U.S. managers score very high on assertiveness and performance. Now, interestingly enough, Russia scores low on performance and future orientation. So you can see how there might be a little bit of tension between these two managers. Other variances are language, interpersonal space, time orientation, and religion. And they're, obviously language is very important. If you can't speak the language of the country, you're going to have a translator. And it's very important that if you don't know how to speak the language, you don't try, because you could really insult. Once you're in the country for a while, you can learn the local language, but be very cautious with that. Interpersonal space. This is very interesting. We don't even think about it much, but it really affects our first communications. Americans and Europeans like 3 to 4 foot of personal space. Latin American and Asian countries will only be a foot. And Arabians are also, that's even closer. I mean, they're very into your space, which makes Americans very uncomfortable. So you have to understand that. One thing, it says communication. I like this. Remember that you don't know what you don't know. So business etiquette must be understood before you go into another country. Make the effort. The internet is full of information about business etiquette. Time orientation is interesting. In the U.S., we look at monochronic time, which means we do one thing at a time. We're very much time sensitive. If we schedule a meeting, we expect it to start, and we try to use our time efficiently. If you look at chronic time, that's we do several things at one time. It's very flexible. It's multidimensional. There's nothing set. You actually can experience this in just within our country. If you go to the southern part of the country, down in South Carolina and Georgia and Alabama, they move on a different time frame, as do Latin American and the Mediterranean countries. Religion. This only mentions, the Catholics. Religion, the Protestants, were employee effectiveness. Buddhists are socially responsible. There are other religions out there that you really have to understand. And again, that's very easy to do by simply going to the network. And one of the major reasons, they've done some studies here, why U.S. managers fail on international assignments. There's lower job satisfaction, there's poor performance, there's adjustment difficulties, and there's high turnover. And most of that can be traced back to being able to be culturally adaptable. So we need to learn patience, flexibility, and tolerance for others' beliefs. And I think we need to train more before we send our managers into a new country. And a question is, an example of a low-context culture is China. And I believe that is the end of Chapter 4. I will bring in more examples of cultural differences, and we'll talk about those. Thank you.